welcome back to the Jacobin Show. I'm Jen Pan. As always, thanks for watching. Please hit like and subscribe. So on today's show, I will be talking to Professor Lily Geismer. She has a new book out called Left Behind that looks at the legacy of the New Democrats, which of course is the wing of the Democrats that took power in the 90s and famously includes former President Bill Clinton, among others. And I'm talking to Lily about how and why the New Democrats pushed policies like free trade, microlending, charter schools, and of course, welfare reform, and how their particular brand of policymaking continues to shape the Democratic Party today. So definitely stay tuned for that. For my segment, I'm going to be talking about weed. Specifically, there have been a few new pushes to legalize weed at the federal level. I should say my state of New Mexico just legalized weed earlier this month. And so all of that got me sort of thinking about how lots of states are now trying to roll out these so-called cannabis social equity programs, which are programs that are theoretically supposed to make sure that the same people who were, harmed by past marijuana convictions and the war on drugs are now in a position to open weed businesses or otherwise benefit from the legal weed industry. So obviously, I think that sounds like a nice idea, but I will be making some comments in a little bit about why cannabis equity basically keeps falling short. And before we get to all of that, I am very excited to be talking to an up-and-coming politician who is running a very scrappy grassroots campaign in the state of Pennsylvania with the backing of several labor unions. So let's dive in. All right, so I am now joined by total stranger Paul Prescod. Paul, I think at this point, everybody watching the Jacobin Show knows that you are running for a state Senate seat in Pennsylvania's 8th District. Among other reasons, that is why you're no longer a regular on the show. And of course, I have to state outright that Jacobin is a nonprofit, so we do not endorse any political candidates. But I did want to have you on the show to talk about some of the specifics of your campaign, because I think it's a really interesting one. There's a lot going on, and because it's a state level race, I think we aren't really hearing as much about it in the media as we would for, something like a national Senate seat. So just to quickly cover the basics of your campaign, you are up against an incumbent who has held the seat for, I think, over 20 years. And what I wanted to focus on is over the last few years, I think on the left, we've really seen quite a few progressive challengers take on long-term incumbents, right? Incumbents who are, a little more centrist, a little more moderate, and that's been met with varying degrees of success. Now, for your campaign, I think what's interesting is a lot of the progressive challengers we've seen in the past have really started out with the backing of kind of traditional progressive groups like the Justice Democrats or the Working Families Party or, Our Revolution or DSA. And just to be clear, you have also gotten some of those endorsements along the way. But what's really unique about your campaign is you began by seeking out labor endorsements. And even beyond that, several of the unions that you brought on board early on were blue collar unions. And I think that that's actually kind of unusual for, a progressive challenger, at least the progressive challengers that we've seen in the last couple of years. So I just wanted to start by asking, why did you choose to go about it this way? And how did you make it happen? I don't think you just showed up to, the door of the Teamsters and you were like, I'm labor, Paul, endorse me. How did it all go down?
Yeah, well, first, thanks for having me on. It's really great to be back home and doing this again. There's many places I can start. Yeah, unfortunately, the Teamsters were not watching the Jacobin show. They didn't know I was labor, Paul. Shame on them. But yeah, I guess I'll start by saying, in a sense, it was like 10 years in the making. Just because, and what feels good about this campaign, politics is not about feeling good, but I think what feels good and effective about this campaign is it really does feel like an organic outgrowth of the work I've already been doing for years, in some ways that our DSA chapter has been doing work for years, with this close partnership with labor. Most of my life engaging politically, I kind of marked the starting date back to 2009, 2010, when I supported a local strike at the university I was going to. I've been heavily involved in labor and building these relationships. And that kind of definitely accelerated these last 4 or 5 years for different reasons. Part of it was engagement with DSA. Part of it was certain flashpoints, like COVID-19. I think there was a big need around workplace health and safety and an uptick in just activity around that. Of course, the Postal Service attacks during the 2020 presidential election. And actually, in all seriousness, the work we had done around defending against those attacks brought us with a close relationship with the local American Postal Workers Union, which is one of the endorsing locals. So it really has just come from, like you said, it wasn't showing up in a room one day and making a great speech. I don't think I'm that effective as a speaker. It really was this work and these relationships over the years. And also say this, as people might already know, often, labor will just back the incumbent in races like this. And there's, I think, many reasons for these. Some of these reasons are understandable, if frustrating at the same time, and I'm not defending it all the time. But, oftentimes with these Democrats, when it's all said and done, you look at their voting record, it's pretty good when it comes to labor. And, the fear is always, well, if we back the wrong person, if this incumbent wins, how will they retaliate against us?
Right.
And you can imagine these egomaniac elected officials, most of them, that's a real thing. So often they don't want to take that risk. So it's really heartening to see that they're not doing that in this race. And I also say this, I think there's always some strokes of luck in any campaign. And I would say this is a combination of luck and political skill, but, there was some good timing, in some of major unions like the Teamsters, District Council 33, which is the second largest union in Philly, representing blue collar city workers like sanitation workers that have endorsed me. They went through recent leadership changes in the last few years. And these were leaders that I had developed a close relationship with before they ran for office. And so now in office, they know I'm not just someone coming to them at the last minute. They know what I stand for. And these are people who are just more open to taking a little bit of a chance. And I really can't tell you if the old guard would have been in power in these unions, would they have backed me? And then what that helped to do is establish credibility early. And I think it's kind of like a train that picks up momentum. And the more they see early on you have these backing, the more safe it feels for other unions to do so. So I think, again, you could call it luck, but it was also, I think, just, again, the relationship building over years that kind of set the stage early, and I think allowed for these other endorsements and things to come in. But, again, it really could not have happened without, again, I think a decade of work beforehand of just showing that, I am serious about labor. No one can question that, just given the work over the years. And again, not just through Jacobin, but, through supporting labor on the ground.
Right. So you garnered a few of these union endorsements very early on, but we're a couple months into your campaign. Your primary is coming up on May 17th, so you basically got a month left. So what has labor's involvement in your campaign looked like so far? I assume they're, throwing some money your way. Is there anything else that the unions are doing?
Yeah, so financial contributions, and hitting doors for us. Although I'll be honest, and I think I should be honest, just for people to get a real inside look. The challenge is, for unions, they of course their main priority is not electoral campaigns. They're dealing with their own membership issues. So the challenge is turning these endorsements into getting members to canvass a lot because honestly, they have a lot of other stuff going on. I think for most unions and most people in general, we don't start paying attention to elections until, I don't know, a month, 2 months out, realistically. So obviously, when you're in the campaign like me, I'm thinking about December is feeling late in the game, but it's really not for most regular people and even unions. So, that's a challenge, just that unions have other priorities besides electoral politics, their own members. So, it's been a challenge so far translating some of that support into knocking doors. But as it's getting closer, that's picking up. People may know we first had to get on the ballot. So we had to get a certain amount of signatures to get on the ballot. And we had Teamsters who were able to get paid time off to help us do that. Some unions like AFSCME District Council 33 and 47, as city workers, part of the city charter, actually bans them from coordinating with the campaign. So they are conducting their own independent canvasses for us, for their slate of candidates, which includes me. And also, I think the word of mouth really helps too. We've had a lot of cool experiences with canvassing. We'll knock on the door of a union member and they can see on their flyer, they're like, oh, well, if my union endorsed you, like I'm going to back you. So that's
Right.
effective. We're planning for election day, having union members covering the polling places, even simple stuff like even the bare minimum of sending out a mailer to your members recommending who they vote for actually goes a long way. Again,
Yeah.
most ordinary people might wake up on election day and look at the mailer and be like, okay, that's who I'm going to take my cue from.
Hmm.
So yeah, it's a variety of levels of support but also, I think it helps connecting with people just on the doors to say, because honestly, most working people still probably don't know what DSA is, or even Working Families Party or Sunrise Movement. But it does help to say, like, hey, the Postal Workers Union endorsed me. I think that connects in a way that it's hard to with other groups that just aren't as well known by people.
Yeah. I want to ask you now about the money in the race, right? Because we had alluded to kind of some of these like union donations a little bit, but I want to make it clear that it sounds like your campaign is, you've got a little bit of the union donations, but your campaign is really powered mostly by small donations, right? Like you're not taking money from any corporations or billionaires or, super PACs. But I do get the sense that there is a lot of big money in the race. I mean, obviously, you're in Philadelphia. There are a lot of wealthy people there. I know that there are quite a few charter school PACs, which I don't think are supporting you. You, Labor Paul, a public school teacher, I'm sorry to say, like, I have a feeling you're
Right.
not getting that money. Talk a little bit about what kind of money is in the race, and then, yeah, just talk about like where you're getting your money.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's a big money race. The state Senate seats, these are larger seats than state House.
Hmm.
And especially my opponent, very big into school privatization. He gets big money from PACs, like you alluded to, especially this one guy named Jeffrey Yass, who is a billionaire, literally, and is the biggest funder of actually Republican Party candidates in Pennsylvania. But he's also my opponent,
Mm.
who is a Democrat, his biggest funder. He has a lot of PACs. This straight line connection to Betsy DeVos. He's also funded like voter suppression efforts in the state. So they're pouring big money into my opponent. Other PACs related to him are doing that. And on our end, we know we're not going to out fundraise someone like that. But I think we've been doing a great job. And like you said, we've gotten some union contributions, but honestly, not much. So we have over 1,400 unique donors. We've raised over $230,000, and like the median contribution is around $50.
Yeah.
So that just shows you like what is going into this. Some other organizations besides unions as well can contribute, but a lot of it is just grassroots fundraising. And yeah, I mean, I can't wait till we have publicly funded elections. I mean, it's especially now being on the other side, you see like literally that if we don't get this money, I can't have staff, I can't have a building, an office,
Right.
we can't have literature. So it really does power everything on this campaign. And of course, this is why the party just prefers people who can self-fund themselves. But
Right.
it really is telling. I mean, at our first campaign finance report, they put out a graph showing like our campaign literally has 7 times as many donors as my opponent, which just shows
Hmm.
he's relying on a few wealthy people
Yep.
writing big checks, and we, have a much broader array of support. But yeah, the money factor unfortunately is just dominant. That's why
Yeah.
candidates spend hours every single day. People probably listening have gotten calls from me begging them for money. I
Pick up
apologize
when
about that.
Paul calls you.
Right.
All right. Well, I wanted to ask a broader question too, which is why run for office, Paul? I mean, we all know on the show you are a public school teacher. You're very passionate about teaching and also passionate about being active in your teachers union. So why not stay a teacher or the host of a YouTube show? To be honest, what exactly is going on in your district that made you think I need to do this?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I mean, I kind of zoom out to answer that first. What makes this kind of ironic is I've just always been someone that has not been that active in electoral politics. I vote and stuff. I've always been someone, and even still believe that being in the labor movement is really the most important thing. my line, shop stewards are the most important position in this country. And I still believe that. I mean, but I definitely was inspired by candidates like Bernie and other local candidates that
Hmm.
show we can't ignore the electoral realm. And realistically, if you think about other countries that have Labor Party, social democratic parties, socialist parties, as flawed as they might be, there's, I think, a more mature understanding that you need to have both. We can't ignore the state, and we need to get our people in the state in
Hmm.
different ways. And there should be kind of a virtuous cycle there, and that arena is important. And I think especially the right kind of candidates, if they can truly reflect like a labor coalition, we need to run those things. And I think especially looking at state legislatures are really important. And we know how important the federal level is, but it's at the state where you can fight austerity, where you can start to try to tax the rich,
Hmm.
create union jobs. There's a lot of revenue to work with. That's where a lot of our public education funding is dealt with, is at the state level. So, and these are seats that are not as overwhelming to try to contest for as Congress. So I think this is an area the left really should look at. And
Hmm.
so, it kind of just struck me at a certain point of thinking about this wave of left candidates we've had these last 5 and 6 years, and kind of thought what you alluded to earlier of like, it would be really nice if we can get more people straight out of the labor movement, people who could maybe start their campaign with that coalition. And it sounds, when you say it, it sounds very egotistical, but I kind of felt like, this kind of makes sense for me in this moment, especially and in specifically my district, some of the highest poverty levels,
Hmm.
poorest zip codes, some of the toughest issues with development that's displacing people, public school funding, all environmental issues. There's a big portion of the district that's on a floodplain, and that's been getting worse as climate change worsens. So there's definitely was a need, and specifically who has been in that seat for so long, one of the most conservative Democrats in the state legislature, which is really out of step with the district itself, which I think is fairly progressive in terms of the voters. Um, and who he's getting his money from, the fact that he's never had anyone primary him, it
Hmm.
literally got the seat handed to him. So I think all these dynamics, it made sense that this person, I think, is vulnerable. We can mount a serious
Yeah.
challenge, and and do this in a way that's reflecting a movement. And I hope afterwards, when we win, is keeping this coalition together of labor, of progressives. After we win, to keep actually getting these things passed.
Speaking of state level legislation, gotta quickly shout out my own state, New Mexico. We recently got free
Right.
public college in New Mexico.
There you
So,
go.
things can definitely happen.
Right.
On that note, what are kind of some big pieces of legislation that if you were elected, you would want to see go forward?
Yeah. It's so hard to choose.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
mean, the very basic one is the school funding.
yeah,
The legislation, what we call the fair funding formula, which would just more equally distribute education funds. And broadly speaking, taxing the rich.
yeah,
Pennsylvania, like many states, but we have a huge problem with the corporate tax loopholes. We're one of the largest natural gas producing states, and they don't even pay a dime in taxes. So really shifting the revenue question in the state has got to happen really for anything, I think, really to get actually passed.
yeah,
And yeah, broadly, and this is something that comes up on the Jacobin show I cover a lot, is the question of green jobs, green
yeah.
union jobs. And I think, again, this is something that we can do a lot at the state level, even if at the federal level we can't get much done. And I've covered this a little bit, but we're seeing more and more states, Illinois, New York, Connecticut, Rhode Island now, are starting to move towards doing this, and doing this with union support from the beginning. So I
Hmm.
think, that to me is really would be one of the biggest crowning achievements, is getting that coalition of labor together to hammer out, all the jobs we could create in transitioning to clean energy. There's really just no limit. Retrofitting buildings, expanding public transit, geothermal, wind, solar, nuclear. There's just all kinds of work that can be created, and other states are figuring it out of how to get this
Yeah.
together and start moving it forward. I think there's no reason Pennsylvania can't be next, and I think I'd be someone that's well positioned to kind of bring that coalition together. So I guess that wasn't a priority. I just listed off many things, but
They're
this is
all
where,
important.
yeah, this is where we I think got to be heading to, and
Yeah.
I'll mention another thing. And I've probably said this before. One of the most inspiring things to me about the Sanders campaign and the possibilities wasn't even just about obviously he supports great legislation, but this
Right.
organizer in chief idea and like what would that actually look like for someone in there who's trying to stoke the flames and use their power and resources to help people organize. And there's so much that can be done with labor at the local level.
Hmm.
One example is that Amazon is actually coming. There's a fulfillment center coming to Southwest Philadelphia in my district. And we
Ah,
know now the Teamsters at the national level are looking at organizing Amazon. They're one of my strongest supporting unions. So playing a role in that fight, and that doesn't require necessarily passing legislation. Like if your party's in the minority, that's not an excuse to not do anything. So working with that union to try to organize Amazon, just like we're knocking doors now, we can knock doors of Amazon workers in the district,
yeah.
telling them to join the union. When there is a strike breaking out, mobilizing constituents to support the strike, cracking down on union busting companies. There's a lot of resources you have as an elected official to do these
Hmm.
things. And I think that would be something I'd be extremely excited about. It's just like doing work in the district to support labor in a way that most elected officials are not going to do.
Yeah. All right, so that reminds me, I have just one last bonus question for you, and it's not about your campaign proper, but since you brought up labor organizing, and I don't have a chance to talk to Labor Paul as often as I did before, I got a question for you about the NLRB. So I
Hmm.
feel like there are a lot of interesting changes going on at the NLRB, and I remember way back when you were my co-host, and Biden had just been elected, we were saying, there are obviously reasons to be skeptical of Biden, but at the end of the day, at least his NLRB appointees will be better than Trump's. I think that's borne out. What do you think?
Yeah.
And what's going on with labor law right now that's particularly exciting?
Yeah, I gotta say, I feel kind of validated. I had this very niche argument that I was harping on about how important the election. I would kind of half joke that I was a single issue voter for the NLRB, and I think it's kind of being borne out.
Hmm.
It really does make a difference. We saw that recently the new general counsel, the head of the NLRB, put out an order wanting to ban captive audience meetings for
Yep.
companies. So I think if people don't know, I mean, this is where, companies are just allowed to essentially isolate workers, give them anti-union propaganda. So that would be a big deal if that is passed and that's actually enforced. They've come down with some rulings, I think, in the cases of Amazon and Starbucks organizing against the companies when they've broken the law, and things like that. So this is a really good sign for the future. And, I always, to be clear, it's not the labor law itself that's going to save us. And
Right.
obviously, the Amazon victory, the workers themselves won that. Starbucks workers, like that wouldn't happen without them. But the NLRB can offer crucial decisions in decisive moments to help tip the scales in their favor and just create an overall favorable climate for workers to organize.
Yeah.
We're not in the same moment, so I don't want to draw a parallel, but going back to the 1930s when unions exploded. Again, it's hard to imagine that happening without a more supportive environment in the state for organizing. Again, it was up to the workers themselves, but having a supportive NLRB can go a long way. And right now, we're in this moment. Workers feel emboldened. I mean, we've seen that for a while. Think back to Striketober. That was more about existing unionized workers striking, but I think more and more workers who are not in a union are emboldened. We're hearing a lot about all these different Amazon and Starbucks sites and probably other companies, people trying to file for a union election. So something is spreading, and the more that there's a supportive NLRB there, the greater chance of success. So I think that is a really good sign. And again, in itself is just an argument for you might as well go in the voting booth and just take 10 minutes to do that or mail in the ballot. Kind of does go a long way in this case.
All right. Well, again, Paul Prescod is not just Labor Paul. He is also running for a state Senate seat in Pennsylvania's 8th District. The primary is on May 17th. Paul, where can people go to learn more about your campaign?
Yeah, just go to paulprescod.com. You will see all the cool endorsement logos. You'll see the platform, what you can do to support. So yeah.
FYI, Paul's also on Instagram and Twitter, so he's being coy about that, but
yes,
hit him up on social media.
Yep, do that
all
as
right. Well, Paul, great to see you, and we'll talk soon.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. Well, in honor of 420, I will be making some comments about weed and cannabis social equity in just a few minutes. But first, a quick message from our sponsor, Verso Books.
Join the Verso Book Club and get every new ebook that Verso publishes every month, as well as 1 to 3 books in the mail. All Verso Book Club members also get 50% off everything on the website. The Comrade tier is only $20 a month for your first 3 months, and if you join in April, you'll get these books. Scorched Earth, Beyond the Digital Age to a Post-Capitalist World by Jonathan Crary, a polemic on resisting the digital world of late capitalism. Half-Earth Socialism, a plan to save the future from extinction, climate change, and pandemics by Drew Pendergrass and Troy Vettis, a radical manifesto to address climate disaster and guarantee the good life for all. Passages from Antiquity to Feudalism by Perry Anderson, classic work in historical sociology. We Want Everything, a novel by Italian poet and activist Nani Balestrini, plus a bonus book, Russia Without Putin by Tony Wood, to understand the historical context of Russia's war against Ukraine. Become a member today at versobooks.com.
We all know at this point that marijuana laws have perpetuated long-running racial disparities in the criminal justice system. According to the ACLU, for instance, a black person is 3.64 times more likely to be arrested for marijuana possession than a white person, even though black and white people use marijuana at similar rates. So over the past few years, lawmakers in states that have legalized recreational weed, including New York, Massachusetts, Illinois, California, and elsewhere, have tried to find ways of making sure that the very people who have been the victims of draconian drug laws are now in a position to benefit from the legal weed boom. Enter Cannabis Social Equity, which includes initiatives like states investing tax revenue from weed sales into communities of color, or, more commonly, prioritizing people from disadvantaged backgrounds and/or with prior marijuana convictions for licenses and loans when it comes to opening dispensaries. I think there are probably genuinely good intentions behind this ongoing interest in correcting the missteps of the war on drugs through these new so-called equity programs. But here's why the rise of cannabis social equity has been nothing short of a neoliberal nightmare. Today, more than 2/3 of Americans want to legalize marijuana, including 83% of Democrats, 71% of independents, and 50% of Republicans. As recreational weed becomes legal in more and more states, lawmakers in those places are also now trying to make sure black and brown people who were disproportionately likely to be targeted during the war on drugs have sufficient representation in the growing legal cannabis industry. So this may sound noble, but cannabis equity programs have been a flop in almost every single state that has tried them. Here's how the business publication Cranes summarized the situation a few years ago. Quote, "From California to Colorado to Massachusetts, cannabis rollout programs have been fraught with controversy and criticism. In nearly every state and locale, activists and budding cannabis entrepreneurs complain that, despite altruistic intentions, the social equity ambitions of legalization have gone awry, and the business remains mostly in the hands of wealthier white businessmen." To look at some examples, back in 2020, Illinois announced it would designate a certain number of dispensary and growing licenses to what lawmakers called social equity applicants. Here's how that went.
By May 1st, the state will award 75 new recreational use dispensary licenses to diversify an industry that is mostly owned by white men. Social equity applicants get priority.
There are points built into the application for who is a social equity applicant, what communities you come from, how have you been touched by this over the course of your life.
Including more points for applicants who have marijuana arrests in their past. Barbershop owner Danny Joe Sorge is one of them, but he and so many others face a daunting task of getting through the application process.
The application itself is very lengthy. It's a 400-page application, and you have to have certain resources and infrastructure in place just to navigate the completion of it.
This application is harder than my grad school application.
2 years later, Illinois' Cannabis Social Equity Program is still struggling to actually award licenses to disadvantaged applicants. As the Chicago Tribune recently found, the complicated and costly application scoring process ended up last year with just 21 of 937 social equity applicants qualifying for the initial lottery to get one of the 75 licenses for the retail outlets known as dispensaries. Furthermore, as a result of the program's extreme and ongoing inefficiency, the state is also now caught up in several costly lawsuits. To date, literally 0 new businesses have come out of the social equity program. A very similar scenario is currently playing out in Arizona, which tried to institute its own cannabis social equity program by earmarking a whopping total of 26 social equity dispensary licenses for low-income people with prior weed convictions. Unfortunately, as an expose by the Phoenix New Times found, it turns out the majority of applications for these social equity licenses came from investors or people connected to established cannabis companies already operating in multiple states. So, as you can imagine, that whole program is also now tied up in a lawsuit. Meanwhile, other states appear to have learned very little from these bureaucratic failures. New York, which will begin rolling out recreational dispensaries by the end of the year, appears to be going down a similar path. In March, New York announced that it would grant its first 100 dispensary licenses to people with past marijuana convictions as part of a cannabis equity initiative. However, the catch is that the state is also requiring that, in addition to having a past weed conviction, applicants must submit financial statements and other paperwork showing that they're already operating a legal and profitable business in the state, which, to say the least, really narrows down the pool of who's eligible. As journalist Ben Gilbert put it, to get a cannabis sales license in New York, you need to have a prior conviction and also 2 years of ownership of a profitable legal business. You essentially need to fit into a Venn diagram of nobody. Worse still is that the complicated guidelines and Byzantine application processes are really only the beginning. As a recent investigative piece in the New Republic found, even when people do manage to get a hold of coveted social equity licenses, they frequently find themselves without the resources to actually get their cannabis businesses off the ground. Bank loans are not an option, as most banks refuse to do business with an industry-breaking federal law, author Amanda Lewis wrote. As a result, cannabis business owners often end up forced to turn to specialized cannabis investors that very often engage in predatory practices. According to Lewis, cannabis companies that incubate social equity applicants might provide loans at 12 to 17% interest rates when the US average is 3 to 7%. They might require the equity applicant to stock the incubating company's product, purchased at locked-in rates above market value, or stipulate that the social equity applicant's business can only ever be sold to the bigger company for a predetermined amount. More cynical financiers might simply offer the equity applicant a $35,000 salary in exchange for total control over the business. So, judging by the record to date, cannabis social equity, as a program supposedly meant to benefit the very communities hit hardest by the war on drugs, has failed miserably on its own terms. There's also another issue at stake. The problem with cannabis equity is not simply that these programs aren't reaching enough Black and brown people, or that they're mired in red tape, or that they open the door to predatory loan schemes, although all of those things are undoubtedly true. The more fundamental problem is that the entire notion of cannabis equity currently rests on the assumption that we can achieve some kind of social justice through the market and by simply encouraging entrepreneurship. But the truth is that even if the cannabis equity application process in every state worked perfectly and 100% of social equity licenses went to social equity applicants rather than to affluent business owners or brokers for big weed, that would still represent only a few hundred people nationwide who get a shot at participating in weed capitalism, which, by the way, doesn't even come with the guarantee of financial success. Meanwhile, keep in mind that between 2001 and 2010, there were over 8 million marijuana arrests in the US, the vast majority for possession. And ironically, several states that have legalized the sale of recreational marijuana still make it incredibly difficult for residents to expunge their past marijuana convictions. To further put into perspective how limited the returns on cannabis equity are, let's consider a path not taken: state-owned and state-run weed dispensaries. Yes, we all know Americans shudder at the thought of state control, particularly over our consumer products. But when you consider that private sector weed sales have already topped over $12 billion in the state of Colorado since 2014, there's an argument that state-run dispensaries would actually generate a huge infusion of revenue that could go to funding public goods like education, healthcare, and infrastructure. Yes, states already collect taxes on weed sales, but what if even more of that money was public? These funds could even potentially provide financial compensation for people who have served time for marijuana offenses or whose past convictions have made it difficult for them to find jobs or housing. By contrast, the private sector cannabis industry is really only set up to enrich just a few lucky business owners. There's also at least one successful precedent for the state-run model. In Pennsylvania, the state currently owns and runs all liquor stores. This not only generates hundreds of millions of dollars in net income for Pennsylvania each year, but also creates thousands of union jobs. Shout out, by the way, to UFCW Local 1776. There's even some evidence that, contrary to myths about the wonders of free market competition, state-run liquor stores actually help keep liquor prices down. So if you ask me, there's no reason why state-operated weed dispensaries couldn't theoretically work in the same way. Instead of messing around with miserable, half-baked equity plans to try to make weed businesses a little more diverse, why not just take the private sector out of the equation completely and create an industry where sales and profits actually go to the public good? The Chicago Tribune once described cannabis social equity as a program, quote, designed to give a boost to individuals and communities that need an infusion of free market enterprise the most. But I think that's exactly backwards. The spectacular failure of cannabis equity shows why tinkering with the market and trying to make it just a little bit friendlier and a little more diverse, rather than confronting the zero-sum logic of the market head-on, will always be a losing game. All right, so we are now joined by Lily Geismer. She is an associate professor of history at Claremont McKenna College. She's also the author of Don't Blame Us, Suburban Liberals and the Transformation of the Democratic Party. And her latest book, which we'll be talking about today, is Left Behind, The Democrats' Failed Attempt to Solve Inequality. Lily, thanks for joining us.
Oh, thank you so much for inviting me.
So let's just dive into your book. Your new book, Left Behind, looks at the legacy of the wing of the Democrats that, we now call the New Democrats. And this is a group that sort of famously includes former President Bill Clinton. And I think just to start, I do want to get into the history of how the New Democrats came to be, but I want to start by asking you kind of a broader question about how the New Democrats really saw the role of government in fighting poverty and inequality. So, Bill Clinton famously enacts welfare reform and deregulates the financial sector. And, I think watchers of the Jacobin show are probably pretty familiar with the idea of, say, like corporate Democrats or neoliberal Democrats. But I think that's something that's really interesting about your book is you point out that just calling them corporate Democrats or saying that they're Republican light is really only part of the story, or it really doesn't get at the whole picture, because regardless of the policy outcomes of the New Democrats, you point out that they really did see themselves in some ways as continuing the legacy of FDR and the New Deal. So I want to start by asking you this. You say that the New Democratic approach can be summed up with the mantra, doing well by doing good. So explain this slogan and how it sort of represents both a continuation of some aspects of New Deal liberalism, but also in other ways, a significant departure.
Yeah, thank you so much for the question. And it shows such sort of great engagement with the book and its argument. I mean, a critical part of it was to try to understand this idea of sort of saying that Bill Clinton is just like the Republicans or the Democrats, I mean, this kind of lumping together of those types of things. And I think it's absolutely true that in many ways, the outcomes are similar, and that many of the things that sort of Reagan and the Reagan wing of the Republican Party and Reagan's administration tried to do actually occurred under Bill Clinton. And the classic examples are welfare and deregulation. But I think this critical question around sort of what is the role of government was one thing that I really wanted to understand. And in some ways, the book is actually trying to understand like a kind of democratic version of neoliberalism, which I see actually embodied in this phrase and this idea of doing well by doing good, which is really the idea of there's still a belief in government. So unlike the kind of traditional sort of Reagan or Milton Friedman view of kind of you like government leaves and you like let the market do its thing. They still believe in an idea of kind of government as a catalyst for connecting the public and private sectors. And that's kind of this idea of the doing well and the doing good and putting them together. But in another sort of important point is that they come to believe that the market can they sort of still have this faith in kind of broad New Deal liberal ideals of kind of equality, helping people in need, which are kind of critical aspects of both the New Deal and the Great Society, but believe that the market can achieve those types of things. And so you instead of like and how I describe this in the book is like, so going back to New Deal, and I think this is often the sort of piece of where the New Deal itself is so complicated. Like the New Deal believed in markets too, but they believed that sort of, I mean, they believed in public and private partnerships, but they really believed in this idea of kind of keeping that the market does one thing, achieves economic growth, and that the government comes in with kind of compensatory or supplementary welfare programs. Like the Clinton New Democrat approach is that those two things come together and that the market can sort of serve that function, and you can bring in the market to kind of to achieve what a sort of robust welfare state once did. So you instead of providing cash payments, it's jobs and entrepreneurship. That's the kind of thinking of this type of approach.
So let's talk a little bit about how the New Democrats kind of came to be. You trace this back to the creation of a kind of mysterious group called the Democratic Leadership Council. What exactly is the DLC, and how did this group sort of help propel the New Democrats to power?
Yeah, so it's fascinating because to many people, they were sort of at the center of American politics for a brief period, but have kind of fallen out of fashion. And they actually, I mean, the story actually even goes deeper than the DLC to this kind of iterations of Democrats coming into office in the 1970s and 1980s. And there was this obsessive quest to figure out a name for them. So the first name is the Watergate Babies, and then because they come into office, and then they're actually called the neoliberals for a while. So they're like the first neoliberals. And then my favorite name is the Atari Democrats. Which I wrote a piece for Jacobin about several years ago. But then it becomes New Democrats under the DLC. And they're a group of people. It's a combination of members of Congress who are part of this kind of Watergate baby group that kind of thought the Democratic Party was sort of out of date. Like one of their big mantras was the kind of solutions of they started with the solutions of the 70s can't solve the problems. The problems of the 30s can't solve the problems of the 70s, and they update that to the problems of the 80s. But they believe in the kind of old style of New Deal. The kind of New Deal liberalism is not working, both in terms of its political economy and also in terms of its coalitions, and especially are concerned about the Democratic Party's feels of the Democratic Party is too beholden to special interest groups, especially to the labor movement. That's one group. And then there's also this group of kind of moderate Southern Democratic governors, people like Chuck Robb of Virginia, who really believe that the party is what's hurting the Democrats is the fact that they're not trying to win over kind of moderate white Southerners, like the kind of people who voted for them. And I should say their emergence, they come together actually at the 1984 Democratic Convention, and initially is where they had their first meeting. And there's this idea that the kind of Democratic Party is in shambles, and they're really frustrated with this kind of the decision or the nomination of Walter Mondale, who they see as kind of this like real sort of failed Democrat who's too close to the labor movement, and that they then decide to sort of form this group called the Democratic Leadership Council. So it's primarily politicians, actually solely politicians, and overwhelmingly white male politicians. And mostly from the South and the West. They do have Dick Gephardt's their first head because he's like from Missouri, and that seems like that's diversification. But then they get into a lot of trouble for how I mean, a lot of people call them kind of this, like that it's like a return of the Dixiecrats. Right. So they do make efforts to kind of diversify, but their real goal, so that's kind of the inside baseball part of them. Their real goal is to kind of transform the Democratic Party. And they really want to kind of, and it's this idea of New Democrats that we're going to like remake who the party is. And within that idea is to make it much more, to make it in line with this kind of constituency of appealing to sort of swing voters, especially former sort of moderates who are seeming to drift toward the Republican Party, but also to remake the priorities of the party. And so by 1990, like one of their core mantras is like, we have to create opportunity, expand opportunity, not government. And how you do that is through market-oriented means.
Right.
And especially in this kind of new economy tech sectors of tech, finance, and trade. So that's really their sort of vision.
Yeah, so let's dive into some of those policies now, because you had just mentioned the New Democrats really started to turn away from labor, not accidentally, but actively, right? And we really think of organized labor as kind of the backbone of the New Deal coalition. But then, of course, as you mentioned, by the 90s, the New Democrats are sort of actively seeking to undermine the influence of labor in the Democratic Party. Can you say a little bit more about what motivated this turn away from labor, and then what they did to kind of push the labor movement out?
Yeah, I mean, so there's this was the part that was sort of, I actually would say was the most surprising to me, because I'd written in my first book about this kind of the reorientation of the Democrats towards more sort of suburban knowledge workers. And I hadn't realized quite how deliberate that was actually until I worked on this project. But a lot of it was this idea that kind of the labor movement was dragging the party down, and kind of both in terms of its like sort of in trying to sort of tailor electoral strategies that way, that kind of making labor the kind of the backbone, which it had been for so long. And I mean, some of it was this idea that there was too many backroom dealings, and that like the sort of AFL-CIO had become this like bloated bureaucracy that they opposed. That was part of the issue, that there was like it wasn't like transparent enough, and this in the kind of some of the older relationships. That was a key piece of it. But the other side of it actually has to do, I mean, it's economic, but they kind of see that that manufacturing and industry is in the past, and that like really what is going to sort of save the Democrats and save the economy is to turn towards the new economy, and so that is in sectors that are non-unionized, and so that's a kind of critical piece too. So this kind of coalition question of kind of how do you capture, trying to sort of tailor a Democratic Party coalition around labor is not going to win elections, but then the other side is like the American economy cannot be wedded to heavily unionized sectors, and so that's really what's drawing their this particular strategy and approach.
Yeah, and that brings up that another key part of the New Democrats' platform was kind of embracing free trade, right? Like Clinton famously pushes through NAFTA in the 1990s. Maybe talk a little bit about that kind of macroeconomic component a little more, because I think that's really interesting. And you know, when I was reading your book, it kind of seemed like the perfect example of how, you know, the New Democrats may have started with some really good intentions. Like they weren't just trying, at least from what I understand, they weren't just trying to, you know, enrich corporations and, you know, destroy American jobs, although obviously, you know, many decades later, that's clearly what happened. But they really built a specific industrial policy. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, it's so, I mean, and I appreciate that. I mean, that's one of the things I really wanted to understand is like, what was their thinking and motivation? I think so often that there's this focus on just like strategy, and that like, I mean, so this is one of the core kind of things I wanted to sort of get at in the book, is that there's this idea that like the embrace of the market, and it's sort of in cynical terms was like Bill Clinton. So things like NAFTA were just all about getting elected. Like they just wanted to get power and get elected. And like there wasn't anything actually ideological about this or an understanding. And I actually like really wanted to think about what were the kind of intents here, and like to get at their words, they believed that this was going to do something. And I think especially, I mean, so in the really beginning in the 1970s, they begin to see the sort of wing of the Democratic Party begins to kind of see that the future lies in globalization and trade. And that's the roots to kind of solving the nation's economic problems. So sort of emerging from the kind of the recessions of the 1970s, and that you sort of invest in those areas. And so they're actually big believers in industrial policy, but industrial policy an industrial policy approach that is focused on things like the tech sector. Right. So it's like it's not going back to like they sort of, I mean, there's this, a lot of the theories are based on, and this is where it gets like really nitty gritty, but on economists like Lester Thurow, who believed in kind of sunrise versus sunset industries, and so manufacturing is like a sunset industry, and that can be sent overseas. Like all of that kind of manufacturing can happen somewhere in the global South, but that the U.S. should sort of focus its policies primarily on these kind of more knowledge-oriented work. And another actually critical person who it promotes these ideas is actually Robert Reich in the 1970s, 1980s. And is very much sort of, this is the way, this is kind of an inevitability, and the United States needs to like get to sort of save the economy is to get on track. And this is going to help. I mean, I think the roots of this also comes to this idea, like that is a relentless focus of Democratic Party policy since the 1970s and 80s, but is on worker retraining. So you retrain former workers, and then they can sort of get these sort of more knowledge-oriented jobs for the future. And that's really the kind of thinking of this approach.
Right. So another major focus of your book is microfinance, right? So I want to zero in on that for a second. Why did Bill Clinton and the New Democrats kind of gravitate to this idea of like microloans and micro enterprise? And how does this idea of micro enterprise really exemplify the New Democrats' approach to dealing with domestic economic inequality?
Yeah. So the interesting sort of one of the things the book looks at is this effort to kind of use microfinance, which we traditionally think of as a international, a tool of international sort of economic development in the United States. And this doesn't, I guess the flash forward is it doesn't work, but so that's why it's not told a lot. But the beginning in the 1980s, Bill Clinton brings Muhammad Yunus, the founder of Grameen Bank, who's seen as kind of the father of micro enterprise, to the U.S. And this idea of kind of giving small loans to poor people so they can start their own businesses. And I think there's a couple of things. Like one is it's this growing faith in entrepreneurship and this kind of idea of kind of an entrepreneurial economy, which is also what they're promoting at the kind of macro level for, that's sort of at the heart of kind of new economy thinking. But at the same time, it's this notion of sort of helping poor people, both that will sort of sustain economic growth. And so Bill Clinton brings it to the Mississippi or the Arkansas Delta, when he's governor, with the idea that this can kind of stimulate the economy, but also help poor people become more self-sufficient. And I think it really is at the heart of kind of that kind of thinking, that like this is where the market itself can do good, that it's helping it's helping people find a sense of sort of self-sufficiency. And actually there is this kind of core part of particularly Bill Clinton's thinking, and this is also what he sort of the ideas of welfare to work too, which is like in the psychological power of having a job. And that becomes important. But I think one of the things actually is really critical, and this goes back to the question of union of labor as well, one of the reasons that the sort of places like the Arkansas Delta were in such trouble and needed programs like this is that they had lost their they were mostly like one factory towns, and the factories had gone overseas. Right. And it turned out that many people actually didn't want to start. Like there was this notion of like the poor as entrepreneur, and that like every sort of like turn your hobby into a business. So if you like love making coffee cake, like you can go, then that should be your business. And that's like, that maybe does work for a few people, but the problem, one of the things that came up was that like a lot of people actually like the stability of a wage right. Job. I mean, they're like the things that come for having a job where you have you have stable employment is really critical. And that's what's not provided if you're your own boss. So there's this idea of selling like empowerment through having your own business, but that doesn't do that. And I think another thing is it obscures the critical class differences between like it's sort of like anyone can be Bill Gates or Steve Jobs, who become these like heroes in the 1990s, but like that's actually not, that they're not the same thing as this poor Black woman who's selling her coffee cake in Arkansas Delta. So that's sort of that's some of the kind of limitations to it. So it's that I mean, or I would say like critical limitation to it.
So speaking of like these ideas of empowerment and choice, I want to ask you also about the New Democrats' approach to education, because, I feel like Democrats historically have sort of thought of themselves or represented themselves as like defenders of public education and allies of teachers' unions. And obviously, compared to the Republicans, that has usually been true. But an interesting thing about the New Democrats is that they were like big proponents of charter schools. So, and again, like I think that this goes back to kind of these notions of empowerment and choice, right? So can you talk a little bit about why they were so interested in charter schools, and then how the New Democrats sought to remake education?
Yeah. So and it is this idea of like education is kind of this critical kind of New Deal value. And I think another kind of critical part of that is this belief in kind of meritocracy as a sort of core idea. There's this long-standing history of kind of, and I think it also is this question of it's a public good to some degree and sort of something that is from the public sector. But the New Democrats actually are the earliest proponents of charter schools. And I think there's often this, it's something that when I worked on the book, didn't fully understand is like we tend to think about charter schools more as a kind of Republican solution. But in the 80s and 90s, the Republicans are really pushing vouchers, which they've now come back to. But that was kind of the kind of core idea of kind of what is choice. And the Democrat version, and this goes back to this kind of idea of what government can do, is that they're opposed to vouchers because that's like a fully privatized, that's sort of a privatized system. And this is still like sort of working within the public sector, but giving people this more of a sense of like your own individual freedom. And that goes to the same thing of kind of promoting entrepreneurship in the same way that you can kind of have a sense of empowerment by choosing what school you want to come into. Another critical piece of it actually is that, so a huge aspect of the New Democrat philosophy around government is this idea of what is at the time called sort of reinventing government, but bringing in techniques of the private sector and the market to make government more efficient. And that's also the thinking around charters, that charters will kind of use these kind of tools of the private sector, of more accountability, more competition. The thinking on charters is that like public schools would have to compete with them. And then that would sort of make everything, make a better system. Right. And that's the thinking, that's sort of a lot of the kind of philosophical idea of kind of why New Democrats and people like Bill Clinton push this. So beginning in the 1990s, and they still believe it's still public charters, and they actually are not full advocates of the kind of private management program. I mean, the sort of the ones that are sort of for profit. So it's still like a nonprofit system, but that's a lot of the kind of thinking. And it is a really interesting question because I mean, one of the teachers unions actually increased in their power within the Democratic Party in the 1990s. I think they're the biggest constituency of the biggest union constituency at the 1992 convention. So they actually hold power, and teachers unions. And so there's a question there of like this kind of sacrificing of that particular constituency around this issue. But the other group that's really does come to really advocate charters and is a critical partner in the Clinton administration and promotion of it is the tech sector and Silicon Valley, who really promote and advocate this idea.
Mm-hmm. So I feel like as we've been talking, I've been hinting a little bit that I am rather skeptical of a lot of these new Democratic policies, right? But I also want to point out, lots of people think of the Clinton era as a time of economic prosperity. He famously had a rare budget surplus. Lots of people, I think, point out that during the 90s, like inflation and unemployment was low. And people point out that the poverty rate actually went down during his tenure. So I guess the question is like, what do these broad indicators miss? And if you, looking back at all of the policies that we really have just gone through, like what is the scorecard here? Did they work at all?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple things. So one, and as for maybe the conversation and as reading the book, like my skepticism is there too on so a lot of these programs. But I want to say one thing is like they're not a lot. So there are a couple things. Like one is they're not all bad ideas in and of themselves. Like it's just that they can't replace the welfare state. And so that's one thing that I like really want to emphasize. But I think the other question in this, what you've identified is that that's the classic retort that I have received from New Democrats, like that is the kind of, or sort of people who are in the more sort of more mainstream Democrats. And that's kind of the story of the 90s. And it is this interesting idea because I'm so intrigued with this nostalgia for the 90s. Right. But I think some of it is some of that. The issue with it is that's true that, and this goes to this idea that like overall growth did well. And this idea, like, so the doing well by doing good, like the economy did well. But the issue that I see sort of coming out of these questions and on the kind of like is that what a lot these programs did is to leave poor and low income people in a much more vulnerable position later for two different reasons. One is the issue of the removal, so welfare, so the efforts to kind of remove, to replace the welfare system with work and entrepreneurship. Another critical one that I look at in the book is around public housing, and to replace public housing with a kind of a more mixed income housing, and then also to kind of promote home ownership among marginalized groups. That coupled with, so you have all of these removals of the kind of what was left at that point of the kind of traditional social safety net, also with deregulation.
Yeah.
And so I think one thing is kind of this relying on the market at a moment, and relying on the economy and sectors like tech and trade and all of these other things. Like the economy itself was changed dramatically through Clinton era policies from the beginning of the 1990s to the end of the 1990s. And so with that, it left people by less than a decade later, much, much more vulnerable to both to predation. I mean,
Right.
from companies. And that's another thing that like the selling, like corporations can do good and can help people. That is both sort of limited, but also is has a predatory dimension to it. But then generally just that the private sector cannot replace what the public sector can and what government can do. And I think that has been very much borne out over the course of the last sort of 15 years.
Right.
And so that's what we've seen. So it's sort of in the moment of like 2000 and, 2001, when Bill Clinton left office, that wasn't fully apparent. But that becomes very apparent, like, I guess 6 years later.
Right.
So that is some of what I see happening. And then I think the other issue that's really important is the ways in which this then alienated, the selling of the market to do good and going around the country and sort of promoting this idea. I think to many people it didn't see the roots or results of that, and it alienated a lot of people from the Democratic Party itself, and sort of no longer either were not voting or then come to actually vote for Republicans and for Trump. So that's another critical piece that I think it also this is this interesting moment because it's the story of kind of Democratic Party dominance and sort of like it's when the Democrats capture the presidency, but at the same time that it sort of sublimated a lot of these other tensions within the kind of Democratic Party coalition.
So I think then I want to wrap up by bringing the legacy of the New Democrats kind of to the present, because again, as we've been sort of discussing, I think over the last 2 decades, we're seeing more and more people, not just on the left, but even members of what we might think of as the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, now increasingly questioning some of these fundamental assumptions that the New Democrats have been pushing. I'm wondering, number one, do you see the New Democrats' influence continuing to persist and continuing to shape the Democratic Party? And then I guess the final question is, what can we do to start rolling back or reversing some of these failed policies and just the inequality that some of these New Democrat policies exacerbated?
Yeah, it's an interesting one because I think culturally the New Democrats don't hold the same power within the Democratic Party. So I think when the DLC closes in 2011, there's been this kind of especially kind of marginalization of Bill Clinton from the party's kind of big sort of marquees at the conventions or whatever it is. But so I think that on that level, there's not the same kind of cultural hold that they once had. I think the policies, this is this thing that the policies have persisted in various different ways. And I think one thing is I think that very much during the Obama administration, there was a kind of celebration of a lot of these ideas and sort of things like entrepreneurship and various different other in tech and all of those, that is kind of a critical piece. So I think that what's happened is there's no longer this kind of selling of the market can do good. That's not I think the sort of big candidates have learned not to say those kinds of things in some capacity, that they don't hold the same kind of power that they once did. So that has gone away, but I don't see there's not the kind of replacement in various different other things. So I think that there's still this commitment to growth that growth can do. We sort of look to economic growth as the solution to a lot of problems that has persisted. Mm-hmm. And so that's one area. I think there's another question that a lot of these, the kind of actual people in many of the kind of the people from both the DLC and from the Clinton administration now do hold positions in the Biden and powerful positions in the Biden administration. So So I'm answering it like a 6-part question. Short answer, I'm sorry to go on.
No, that's great.
One thing I think one area that I see the kind of concern, like the kind of return and resurgence, is this question around how do you build an electoral coalition? And so this tension that was a fight in the 1980s around the Democratic Party about, do you focus on trying to win over like moderate kind of swing voters in the suburbs, or do you try to really kind of center on marginalized groups? That tension has really reemerged, and I think one thing that I look to is kind of see happening is like things like the midterms is Biden and the kind of mainstream of the Democratic Party going back to the idea of like, we have to win over moderate Democrats and sort of swing voters as the kind of key to the electoral coalition. And that's a dangerous legacy to some capacity from this. But the other side of like what we can do to change that, like what I see as sort of places to change it, is a couple of things. I mean, one is to work on reinstituting certain forms of regulation.
Yeah.
And to sort of think hard about kind of this notion. I mean, a lot of these policies come from this idea that you could sort of erase the boundary between the public and private sectors. And the efforts to kind of reinstitute those boundaries, I think, are really critical. So efforts to kind of reinstitute and expand actually many of those kinds of things. To not think that the market can do good. So that's some of the critical parts, but also to really shore up the power of things like the labor movement and so seeing that happening to me. I mean, that's sort of really critical to sort of understanding. So the other piece of this is the story of the kind of marginalization of labor from having a voice both in the party, but like that made me think like sort of nationally. And I think that sort of in really sort of encouraging that to any capacity is really critical to kind of addressing some of the kind of core forms of inequality that became exacerbated in the period that I look at.
Right. All right. Lily Geismer's book, again, is Left Behind: The Democrats' Failed Attempt to Solve Inequality. We will link that down below. Lily, thank you so much for your time. It was good to see you.
Oh, thank you so much. I really enjoyed it.